My name is Bree, and I am the Welfare Rights Centre's Events and Communications Officer. I am joined this afternoon by our Senior Solicitor, Julius, and our First Nations Access Officer, Alentia. I would like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. We at Welfare Rights Centre acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are today, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to elders past and present. We respect that this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Welfare Rights Centre is a community legal centre specialising in social security and family assistance law. We provide thousands of New South Wales residents each year who have a problem with Centrelink with information, referrals, and legal representation. Our peak organisations. Our peak organisations are Community Legal Centres New South Wales and Economic Justice Australia, who we work with to advocate for law reform. Just to reiterate, today's presentation is general information only, not legal advice. Clients should obtain legal advice about their individual circumstances. We can't answer any specific legal questions today, so if you do have questions, please keep them broad and put them into the chat. So now we're going to launch our poll. The question today is, what kind of issues have you seen recently? So it looks like there's some really clear winners here. Understanding how the system works and what's required, and accessing expert Centrelink staff seem to be the biggest issues, along with income tests and declaring income. So now I'll hand it over to Julius.
Hi everyone, my name's Julius. I'm one of the senior solicitors here at Welfare Rights, and I'm going to be talking for our presentation on student payments and Centrelink today. So just a bit of an overview of what we'll cover this afternoon. We're going to go into some detail about youth allowance, AB study, Oz study, a little bit about special benefit payments, and then some of the issues that can come up with these payments, including the income and assets tests, whether someone's dependent and independent, approved courses for study, study load requirements, the allowable time, the time you're allowed to receive youth allowance and complete a level of study, mutual obligation requirements, and a little bit about the appeals process and appealing Centrelink decisions. All right. So to start off with, we've got a bit of a snapshot or rationale of the Centrelink system. So it's really based on a number of things like whether you can work. If so, there's payments like job seeker, youth allowance, parenting payment. Youth allowance is a job seeker in particular. Whether you can't work because of age or disability, because of caring or studying requirements. Then there's other payments as well that provide additional support. For example, if you're raising children, like the family tax benefit, childcare subsidy, and some other payments, such as mobility allowance, carer supplement, rent assistance. Now, there are, of course, issues. This isn't always a neat sort of system. You know, there are problems that can happen. For example, if you're studying, but youth allowance isn't enough and you've decreased your study load, you know, you don't neatly fit into the youth allowance criteria anymore. Is there anything else you could get? It's possible that someone could be eligible for job seeker payment, for example. That's something we'll get onto a bit later as well. All right, so where to begin? There's three main payments we're going to talk about today. These are Oz study, youth allowance, and AB study. Oz study is specifically for students who are 25 or older and are studying full-time. AB study specifically for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. And then there's youth allowance, which is this complicated sort of catch-all that has a few different variations depending on whether you're studying or whether you're looking for work. Now, there are some common requirements amongst these payments. For example, you typically need to be an Australian permanent resident. So that's someone either a citizen, hold a permanent resident, maybe some specific subclasses of visa. Generally, your eligibility does depend on your visa status. For example, student visas aren't eligible for any Centrelink payments whatsoever. There are other eligibility requirements as well. For example, there's income and assets tests, and other requirements specific to the payment as well, such as whether you're looking for work, undertaking study, or an apprenticeship. So to start off with, we'll go into youth allowance. So youth allowance is split into two separate, I guess, subcategories of youth allowance. There's youth allowance if you're a student, so that's someone who's studying, and then youth allowance if you're a youth allowance job seeker, so if you're a young person who's looking for work. Some of the issues that can come up, I guess, are specific to these categories. For example, if you're a student, whether you're meeting the right level of study load for the payment, whether your course has been approved, time limits for studying, income, whereas with youth allowance job seeker, really it's meeting and maintaining your mutual obligation requirements, and then other issues that can come up, for example, income and assets. Youth allowance has been further split into whether you're considered dependent or independent. Really what that is if you're considered dependent, it takes into account your parents' income in assessing whether you're eligible for the payment. If you're independent, it doesn't take into account the parents' income generally. There are two situations where it may happen, but we'll discuss much later on. Generally, it is quite difficult to get treated as independent for youth allowance. There are some situations where it's automatic, but again, we'll go into that in a bit more detail later. Youth allowance also has age requirements to be eligible. So for example, if you're a young person who's looking for work, you need to be 16 to 21. If you're studying full-time, it's generally 18 to 24. There are some requirements where you can get it at a younger age. For example, if you're 15 and the minimum school leaving age for your state is 15, you might be eligible for youth allowance in certain circumstances. There's also additional requirements that can apply if you're a high school student. Youth allowance, once you turn 25, you can keep receiving it until you've finished the current course you're studying. If you begin a course of study and you're over 25, you'd generally be eligible for Oz study instead. So youth allowance doesn't cut off once you turn 25 if you're already studying a course. So next we'll go into a little bit of detail on Oz study. Oz study, it's typically a payment that's payable to older students, so people aged 25 and older. Again, it has those common eligibility requirements, right? You need to be in Australia, an Australian resident when you're applying for the payments. You need to be studying full-time. We'll go into study load a bit later as well, or completing an approved course at an approved institution or an apprenticeship. Generally, you can't get Oz study if you've completed a PhD. There's also limits on the courses that are eligible for Oz study. For example, there's only specific master's level courses that are eligible for Oz study. It's also limited by what's called allowable time. This is the amount of time you're able to receive Oz study and study at a level of education. So for example, if you're studying a degree that's more than a year long with no year-long subjects, let's say it's a 3 years bachelor's degree, the allowable time is the minimum of time it takes to complete the course plus an additional semester. So we've got an example here where, sorry. Sorry, folks. I got a bit lost there. Okay. Oz study also has rules around your eligibility, whether you've completed this same level of course before. So you can only do one level of education within a 10-year period. So for example, that's one bachelor's degree within a 10-year period. We've got a case study here, Jack's enrolled in a Bachelor of Arts back in the first semester of 2014. I mean, he's withdrawn from the course at the end of his second semester of 2014. Then in semester 2 of this year, he's decided to enroll in a different bachelor's degree, a Bachelor of Science. He's undertaken one semester of study in this previous level in the same 10 years, that's semester 2 of study, so that'll be taken into account in his allowable time. But he should be eligible for Oz study for presumably most of his course there. Now we've got another example as well about time spent studying at a particular level. So this is someone who's finished a bachelor's degree at the end of 2024 within the minimum 3-year period. They want to do another bachelor's at the start of next year. Because they didn't exceed the full 3.5-year allowable time period, they can be eligible for Oz study for next year, but only for the one additional semester for the half a year that they have left of their allowable time for this study. There are different rules as well, for example, for students with disabilities. And you can find more information in the link there. All right, that's just a very, very brief overview to begin with. We'll go into a bit more detail in some of these topics a bit later on. Does anyone have any questions before we move on to talking about AB study?
There aren't many questions at the moment, but Lindy would like to know, does it mean that you can only get Oz study support for one vocational qualification at a level, for example, one Certificate 3?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right, but it is only for one Cert 3, and then I guess you could probably get it if you're doing a Certificate 4 on top, and then a diploma, bachelor's. Oh, is the sound echoing?
It's fine for me.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's fine. I'm sorry, Marty, it might be on your end.
Oh, no, it looks like it's okay. All right, perfect. Any other questions?
So yep, sorry. As far as how it differs for students with disability, will you be going into that later or?
I don't think we actually go into it much today.
Okay.
Unfortunately, it's not something we come across too often, which is a bit of a shame.
Okay. Do you know what happens when it's a combined bachelor/master's degree when calculating maximum allowable time? I think they mean, with the maximum allowable time, does that include
with a
masters?
combined bachelor's and master's? That's hard to say, and I guess it's because generally a lot of master's courses aren't eligible for youth allowance. It depends on a number of things, right? For example, whether that is an allowable course for youth allowance or Oz study. It's also payment specific there as well. So unfortunately, it gets complicated very, very quickly with these student payments.
Yes, I do know personally with Oz study and masters, it is a very small group of masters that you're allowed to do on Oz study.
Yeah, with double degrees, for example, so let's say it's a Bachelor of Laws and a Bachelor of Arts, you can get youth allowance for that. I imagine it would have different allowable time rules, probably. I think the minimum time, for example, a Bachelor of Law and Arts is probably 5 years, so it might be 5.5 years allowable time. Really, it depends on the course.
Okay, that's it for now. And I might see if I can find some links that help with those answers and put them in the chat while you're moving on.
All right, fantastic. And Alantia, are you there? I'll hand over to you now for AB study.
Thanks, Julius. So hi everyone, I'm Alintia Weldon Otzi. I'm the First Nations Access Officer at the Welfare Rights, and today I will be briefly just touching on AB study. So AB study is a payment which is made up of allowances which are available to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students and apprentices. To be able to receive AB study, you must meet a 3-step criteria, which is the same as proving your proof of Aboriginality. So you have to you have to, one, be of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent. You have to identify as such, and be accepted in the community in which you live or have lived. You also must be an Australian citizen that normally resides in Australia. So when applying for AB study, they generally will accept the self-declaration of Aboriginality, but if required later, you will need to prove those 3-step criteria. Next slide, please. So this is just a general snapshot of how AB study works. So when you do apply for AB study, there is a 2-step procedure that Centrelink does apply. So they will look at which award that you might fall under, which your circumstances might meet, and then they will then have a look at what payments that fall under that particular award, and they will determine which payments you might be able to get. So these are the 7 awards that fall under AB study. Schooling A and Schooling B are generally for students who are aged 15 years and younger. So you can get AB study for primary age students. There is a strict eligibility criteria for that. Schooling B is for students who are ages 15 to 16 and who have started high school. The tertiary payment is available for AB study students who are at university and TAFE. The part-time award is similar to the tertiary payment, but you actually won't meet that full-time study requirement. So AB study will have a look at paying you under that part-time award. There's a testing and an assessment award, which AB study can help assist students with going and undertaking testing and assessment to gain entry into the tertiary education. So they can actually pay for the cost of students traveling back and forth to undertake those. There's also a master's and doctorate award, which actually has more allowances than any other of the 7 awards. And then there's a lawful custody award, which you can get for those who are obtained in prison. So depending on the type of study, training, and your personal circumstances, AB study will generally have a look at which awards that you might fall under, and then they will also have a look at the payments that come under it. Sorry, can we just go back there a little bit? Back to that. So this is really important. So just because you may be eligible for an AB study award doesn't mean that you're automatically entitled to all the benefits and allowances payable under that award. So as we'll see a bit further, we'll see how those allowances and payments work. So once AB study has a look at the award that you might get, these are the payments that fall under each of those 7 awards. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, just because you're ineligible for a particular award doesn't mean that you'll automatically get all the allowances that are payable under that particular award. It is very complicated. And what we'll see is in the next slide is actually a table that will give you a general idea of how the allowances and payments work.
So, Alentia, I just wanted to ask a quick question. So each award has its own eligibility criteria, and then there's eligibility criteria you need to meet for each payment under that award.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
it is incredibly complicated.
It is very, very complicated. And yeah, it's really depends on sort of what an individual circumstances are as to what payments that you could get under AB study. So like youth allowance and Oz study, approved courses are primary school, as I mentioned. So primary and high school students can receive AB study. Masters and doctorate courses, you can receive AB study, and then accredited Indigenous special courses, you can receive AB study for. There are some exclusions in terms of eligibility of AB study approved courses. So government funded programs, generally you won't be able to receive AB study. If your course is made mostly away from home-based activities, then you won't be able to receive AB study. So for example, if you're studying a course that's in block periods, and you do have to go away and do some activities for the purposes of meeting the requirements of that course, then AB study will have a look at paying you for those. And also, if a course is generally not available to all students in Australia, then that is an excluded course for the purposes of AB study. And just in that little orange line down the bottom, there is a different criteria if you are in custody and you were trying to access those AB study payments under the lawful custody allowance. So this table is actually from the AB study guide. I should have mentioned at the beginning that AB study is quite unique and it is very different from other Centrelink payments. It does come from a 460 policy manual guide. The table that you can see on the screen is actually extracted from that guide, and we will provide a URL if anyone is interested in having a look at that. So basically on the top here, it has the 7 awards that are payable under AB study. And then on the left-hand side, it has the allowances that you could receive depending on certain circumstances. So at the top here, they have the Schooling A award. So you can't give the living allowance with that. You can get it with the Schooling B award, the tertiary award, and so on and so forth. Just to provide some further context, I know that the table is super confusing. The allowances are very confusing, along with the allowances that are payable under that. So I do have a case study, which I hope provides some further context as to how those allowances work. Okay, so this scenario is based on the tertiary allowance. So we do have Anna and Andrew. They are both first-year students, and they are both studying an undergrad degree. Andrew has had to move from Queensland, so he's relocated from Queensland to New South Wales to undertake studies, whereas Anna does live locally and she only has to commute a short distance to university. So just based on the different circumstances, because Andrew has actually had to relocate from Queensland, he does have a wider range of allowances that are available to him under that tertiary award. Now, just because Anna is also eligible for that exact same award, as we'll see, because she's not commuting a long distance to the university, she's actually exempt from some of the allowances that Andrew is able to get. So yeah, as we can see here, Andrew would be able to get 5 of those payments, whereas Anna would only be eligible for 3. And that is really just another demonstration as to how those allowances work based on your individual circumstances when you apply for AB study. Like the other payments that Julius just touched on, there are limits of assistance and reasonable time for AB study. So the limits of assistance are the number of courses that you can receive, which is dependent on your level of study. So AB study will not pay you for 2 undergraduate degrees. So if you do a degree in nursing and then you want a bachelor degree in nursing and then you want to go do another bachelor degree in something else, AB study will not pay you for the second. They will pay you, however, to do an undergrad degree. And then if you choose to progress onto a master's or a doctorate, AB study will actually pay you under those awards. And as I previously mentioned before, the master's and doctorate awards have a wider range of allowances that are available under AB study. Reasonable time. So AB study won't pay you for 15 years to study a degree. There are strict timelines in terms of how long you can receive AB study for. So generally, if a course is 2 years or less, it is up to twice the length of the course. If your course is 2 years or more, which most bachelor degrees are, so it'll be an additional 2 years on top of what it would take to study full time. So if your course is 3 years and you had an extra 2 on top, AB study will pay you for the 5. Now, there are exceptions that apply if you can prove that there are circumstances beyond your control, and Centrelink can actually grant an extension of time if that does happen. It's also really important to note that AB study, Centrelink won't notify you if you're at risk of exceeding the reasonable length of time, and you do risk sort of going into that overtime and actually being cut off from AB study, and they won't let you know. That will just generally happen on its own. Sorry, guys, that was a lot of information in a short time frame, but do we have any questions?
Sorry, just one second. I was just replying to another person. Okay, so okay, there's one here. If Andrew, just a name, has to go on a rural placement for his course, will he get an additional type of payment for rent and food with AB study?
So there are some things that AB study will pay for if you're required to go away. So that will come under the away from base assistance. There are also eligibility requirements for that particular circumstances as well. So depending on whether that's a predominant requirement of the course, like as a part of the course, he and everybody else that's undertaking that is required to go away. Ab study generally will cover that. I'll also go on and attach some links about those away from base activities so you can have a read on that.
Okay, there's another one here. Jays would like to know, can you progress from a certificate 1 to 3 diploma and then a degree in total, or is it 3 years total study in 10 years?
No, so if you're doing a Cert 3, 4 and diploma, so Centrelink will, Ab Study will look at that as being sort of separate. So that is a level of progression with the certificates that you're undertaking. So it's only if you did, Cert 3 twice in 2 different courses that Ab Study might not want to pay that. That's a similar concept with the bachelor. So it's not like the total time, it's just not paying you to do the same certifications like more than once, if that makes sense. Yeah.
And that's similar with youth allowance and Oz study, where they'll only pay you for, particularly for Oz study, one level of course. So one Cert 1, one Cert 2, one Cert 3, etc.
I'll find that information and I'll actually put the link on in terms of doing those lower level courses like Cert 3, 4 and 5. Sorry, 3, 4 and diploma. I'll put a link in there about the limits of assistance with that.
And what sort of extenuating circumstances will Centrelink consider?
In the policy guide, there's not, specific indicators as to what would meet extenuating circumstances. I'm guessing generally would be, misadventure, illness, all of those sorts of things that you may apply for with extensions whilst you're studying. You might be able to use that documentation for the purposes of getting an extension from Centrelink. I know for AB study as well that they will accept letters from academic advisors that may be able to clarify and just vouch for the student as to what's going on and why study has delayed and things like that. So there's definitely avenues that you can look into, but there is no exact sort of criteria as to what an extenuating circumstances is. So that option is available though, and it's always worth looking into.
Okay, I think just one more. Are there separate policies for children under state care?
For AB study, no. So AB study pretty much covers everything that would come under. So state care is in the AB study policy manual. We actually don't touch on that currently. But I can also have a look at that in the guide and just put a section and just refer you to that section in the guide if you wanted to have a look at that.
Okay, so there was just one more question. Just to clarify, with vocational TAFE students, are they able to do several same level courses, like if they're 6-month courses, say, to explore different skills with AB study, or is that not possible?
I'm not sure. I'm not very confident to answer that. I think that's something that I would have to go and have a look at and just clarify and have a look through the manual. I'm not sure in terms of doing the same courses 6 months apart. I'd have to have a look at that.
Okay, that's all for now.
Thanks, Marie.
Right. Thanks so much, Valentia.
Thanks.
Okay, and now we'll jump into income and assets. So pretty much all Centrelink payments have income and assets tests. The income and assets tests generally differ between payments. For example, the income test for carer allowance is much different to the income test for job seeker payment. Carer allowance, I think it's a $250,000 annual limit for income to be eligible. Job seeker, it's much, much, much lower. All right, but to start off with, let's talk about assets. So there are assets tests for youth allowance, Oz study, job seeker payment. There are also assets tests for AB study living allowance. Here's the assets test, I believe, for job seeker, youth allowance, and Oz study. I think it's the same assets test that applies across those 3 payments. So for example, if you're a single person and you own the home you live in, you can have up to $314,000 worth of assets before your job seeker payments cut off. If you don't own the home you live in, it's $566,000 before your job seekers cut off. Some assets that are included in the assets test can include things like your savings, shares, cryptocurrency, your car. So, for example, if you drive, I don't know, a Lambo or a Ferrari, that's going to probably make quite a dent in your assets test there. Generally, if you do own your own home, the value of your own home, if you're living in it, isn't counted towards your assets test. But if you don't live in it, then it is counted towards the assets test. So, for example, if you own, I don't know, an apartment in Surrey Hills, that you're not living in, the value of it is probably likely to put you over the assets limit. But if you did live in it, it wouldn't be counted towards your assets limit. Most Centrelink payments, pretty much all of them, have income tests as well. The income test differs depending on the payment you're receiving. With reporting income in Centrelink, you always need to report the gross amount of income. So you need to report how much you're earning before tax, not after. Many people get tripped up, or at least used to get tripped up by that quite a bit. Hopefully it's eased up with Centrelink in the last couple of years introducing their single touch payroll reporting. I certainly seem to see issues with reporting less frequently since that. Income's also generally reported fortnightly when you receive the income. There can be different rules around reporting as well. For example, if you're a sole trader. Income tests as well, they generally have an income-free threshold, so an amount you can earn before your payment starts to reduce. It's also affected by a number of factors, for example, like whether you're in a relationship, whether you have dependent children, the number of kids you have, their age. There are additional income tests that can apply as well for youth allowance. If you're dependent, then your parental income is going to be taken into account. I'll touch on those figures a bit later on when we go into independent and dependent youth allowance. There is also what's called an income bank for youth allowance, and for job seeker, it's called working credits instead. So this is, I guess, sort of a bank you can accrue during the time you're on a Centrelink payment. I think it accrues at $48 a fortnight, and then it's reduced by $1 for every dollar you earn. For youth allowance, I think you can have $3,500 total in your income bank, but if you transfer over to job seeker, only a small proportion carries over. I think it's 1,000. Sorry, no, it's 12,700 is the income bank for youth allowance. And so for an example, we've got the income test here for AB Study, Youth Allowance Student, and Oz Study. So we can see here on the left, it tapers down first. So once you earn between $509 and $610 a fortnight, if you're a single person with no kids and you're younger than 18 living with your parents, it's reduced by 50 cents for each dollar over $509. And so it seems to be the same for all of those there. And then it further reduces once you cross that second threshold of $610 income a fortnight. And then at the very end, we've got the cutoff limit. So for example, for a single person with no kids who's 18 or older and living with their parents, you can earn up to $1,292.17 before your payments reduced to zero for that fortnight. Just also a heads up, regular gifts from immediate family members, they don't count as income and aren't assessed as income for Centrelink payments. So for example, if you're a student, who's studying at uni and your parents give you, let's say $100 a fortnight to help out with your rent or your expenses, that regular gift from immediate family members, your parents, wouldn't be assessed as income. With youth allowance in particular as well, there's also two different income tests depending on whether you're on the youth allowance student or the youth allowance job seeker, the youth allowance looking for work. It's much more generous on the student side of things. So we can see here, if you're on youth allowance student, your payment reduces by 50 cents in the dollar for each dollar over $509, and then 60 cents for every dollar over 610. Whereas if you're on youth allowance job seeker, it's 50 cents in the dollar for each dollar you earn over $150. And then the cutoff point is quite a lot lower as well. For youth allowance student, it's $12.92. For youth allowance job seeker, it's $832. And so we've got a bit of a question there. What happens if you're studying, you can't live on youth allowance student, and so you've decreased your study load to try and take up more work? What can you do there? You'll run into issues because you've reduced your study load, particularly if it's under a full-time study load. So you might not be doing enough to be eligible for youth allowance as a student anymore. In some situations, you might be eligible for youth allowance as a job seeker instead. That's something we'll touch on towards the end as well. All right, but we've got a brief case study now. Before I begin that, let me just check that I have shared my sound. Yep. Can someone give me the thumbs up if you can hear this?
Hi, Sarah. I'm Donna. I'm one of the solicitors at the
Fantastic.
Welfare Rights Centre. I hear you're having a problem with your Centrelink payment. They've told you that you've got a debt. Is that right?
Yeah, thanks for ringing me back. Should I just explain it now?
Yeah, that would be great. Look, from the notes I've got here, you said it's about $7,300 and was for a New Start payment?
Yeah, that's right. I was getting New Start and now they're saying I owe them more than $7,000.
So what can you tell me about it?
Okay, well, a couple of years ago, I was doing chemical engineering at UTS, but I had to withdraw.
Okay, when was that?
At the end of the first semester in 2018, because I actually hated it, so I decided to withdraw. And I'd been on AusStudy, so I told Centrelink that I'd stopped, and they said it was all good. So I went on to New Start allowance straight away.
And did you go on to? So you went on to it straight away?
Yeah, it was pretty straightforward. There were no major hassles.
Great.
And then I was working at Macca's and reporting my income, my hours of income at Macca's while I was at uni. And even though that was super painful because I was working casually and I didn't have set hours, but I knew I had to do it. And then after I quit uni, I kept working at Macca's, but they couldn't give me more hours. So I just got another job waitressing, and then I had to do the income reporting for both jobs.
So when you were reporting to Centrelink, did you have pay slips to base it on, or did you have to sort of work it out and do the maths and calculate it yourself?
Sometimes I had pay slips, but not always, and that made reporting it really, really annoying. But I kept working it out and doing it every fortnight. It took a lot of effort just to make sure it was done properly.
Yeah, it certainly can.
Yeah, so I'd report it each fortnight and I hardly ever got the full New Start, and basically it changed nearly every week. And then I finally got a full-time job last year, which was great because I was so over not knowing how much money I'd have each week.
So when was that? When did you start the full-time job?
In December. And they stopped the New Start because I earned too much. But now I've got a letter saying that I have a debt. Well, I'm not sure if it's a letter. It's just some kind of form thing saying that there's something payable, and I cannot work out why because I always declared my income and the letter doesn't explain anything, so I'm pretty annoyed. I have to pay them more than $7,000. Like, how is that possible? That's massive.
Look, do you happen to have the letter there with you? Are you able to read out exactly what it says?
Yeah. So it says, for the period 2nd of July 2018 to 7th of July 2019, you were overpaid New Start allowance. The correct amount of earnings from employment was not taken into account in the payment made to you. This means that you have been overpaid. We are required to recover this amount.
Okay. So look, it looks like they believed you earned more money than you were actually declaring to Centrelink. So look, tell me when you were doing your declaring, is there a chance that you declared the net amount rather than the gross? Do you know what the difference is?
I don't think so. I mean, I think I declared the gross, but it's so long ago. I mean, when I first started declaring, that was like back in first year uni, and that was 2017.
Okay. Look, how were you actually reporting each fortnight? Were you doing it over the phone? Were you on the MyGov app? Were you doing it in person?
Usually it was on the app, but sometimes it wouldn't work, so I'd have to call up and wait on hold for ages and then report over the phone.
Okay. Look, thinking back, did you know that you had to report accurately? Did you receive any letters or information from Centrelink about exactly how to report and exactly what you were supposed to be reporting?
I had an interview when I first went on payment, but I can't remember what they said. I never used to read the letters. I just made sure that they said I would be getting paid, and that was all I cared about, really.
Okay. Look, you said that your New Start used to change every fortnight. Did you think you were getting the right amount of money in your bank account, or were there times that you thought that maybe it wasn't quite right?
And I thought it was right. I just assumed that Centrelink would get it right, really. I mean, I just thought they would know.
Cool. Look, as you said, from what you've been saying, it's not exactly obvious what's happened to you and whether it's correct. If you like, we can have a closer look at it for you.
Okay, thanks.
Cool. Look, the first thing we need to do is get a copy of your file.
All right, so that was just a brief video case study on, I guess, some of the examples and pitfalls that can come about with income and Centrelink payments. For example, Centrelink debts. This young person's had a debt raised, possibly because they were underreporting or reporting incorrectly while they were getting job seeker payment. It also, I don't know if anyone picked up on it, but there's some issues that can come about. For example, it's possible that they might have been underreporting their income from an earlier point in time when they were on Oz study. So there could be a risk if they did ask for an appeal of that debt, that the debt could possibly increase. We go into much more information though on Centrelink debts in our specific debt CLE. All right, so any additional questions at this stage?
Just one really currently. If somebody is under 18 and in a care situation and they are receiving youth allowance payments, would they be classed as independent or dependent?
In a care situation, is that like in state care?
It says, I believe so. It says under the care of a minister.
Okay, yeah. Presumably they should be independent from the sounds of it if they're in state care. It is something we'll touch on briefly later. The rate of payment, interestingly enough, that they get, though, it depends on whether the state care they're in, whether they're in supported or unsupported accommodation. For example, if they're in supported accommodation, they'll get what's called the if they're in unsupported accommodation, they'll get what's called the living away from home rate of youth allowance. They'll get a lower rate if they're in supported accommodation. From the sounds of it, though, yeah, generally someone in state care should be treated as independent. Whether they're under 18, though, and if that has any bearing or any issues with that, I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Okay. That's all of the questions at the moment. Just to remind everybody, if you do have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. Just try to keep them broad as we cannot give out any legal advice today. Thanks, Julius. Just wanted to say with the questions, when you are putting a question into the chat, if you could just please write which payment you are specifically referring to, if possible, that would be great.
Yeah, and I think it's a sign of how complicated some of this stuff is, but there's so much crossover and some small differences between some of these issues and each of these payments we've talked about. All right, so the next topic we wanted to talk about today is dependent or independent. So whether you're considered dependent or independent for youth allowance really depends on a number of factors. One of the key issues around this is whether your parents' income is taken into account. So for example, if you're dependent, your parents' income is taken into account in deciding whether you're eligible for youth allowance or the amount of youth allowance that you can receive. So for example, if your parents' income is less than $62,633, you're eligible for the full rate of youth allowance, presumably, as long as you meet all the other eligibility requirements. Shouldn't be any issues. If your parents earn more than that, then your payment's reduced by 20 cents for each dollar that's over $62,000. So it's quite a low parental income cutoff limit there. For this year, it uses the parents' income from the 2022 to 23 financial year. There is some flexibility around that though, depending on, whether the parents' income has changed, for example. Let's say if the parents, have had a massive drop in income, maybe they've lost their job during COVID and have become unemployed and are on an income support payment now. That's quite a change. The number of kids as well that the parents have changes the parental income threshold. But mind you, it doesn't apply if the parents are getting $1 of an income support payment. So if they're receiving something, an income support payment, for example, job seeker, parenting payment, disability support pension, carer payment, Oz study themselves, then the student should be able to get youth allowance. All right, there is also what's called the away from home rate. So this is a higher rate of youth allowance that you can get if you need to live away from home. It is specifically though, if you need to live away from home and meet all of these other eligibility criteria. If a student chooses to live away from home, let's say, for example, they're living in Sutherland and they're studying at UNSW and they decide to move out of home and live in Randwick, then, that by itself wouldn't be enough to entitle them to the away from home rate of youth allowance. Some of the criteria are if you're 21 or younger and you need to move away from home to access your study or look for work and you're significantly more likely to find employment. There's also requirements around, for example, the amount of time it takes to travel to your place of study. So you might be eligible for the away from home rate if you need to move away from home and it takes more than 90 minutes by public transport to get to your place of study. So I guess a good example of that could be if your parents live in Dubbo and you're studying at University of Sydney or UTS. It's much more than 90 minutes by public transport from Dubbo to Sydney, that's for sure. All right, so next we've got whether you're dependent or independent. And the main impact this really has is whether your parents' income is taken into account in assessing the amount of youth allowance you can receive, and I guess from that, whether you're eligible for youth allowance if your parents earn too much. There are a number of different ways that Centrelink can consider you to be independent. So first of all, you're automatically considered independent for youth allowance if you're over 22. So as soon as you hit 22, you're considered independent. Your parental income's no longer taken into account. Some of the other criteria include if a young person is a member of a couple. So if they're living in a relationship de facto or married with a partner, if the young person has a dependent child themselves, they can be considered independent. Two of the main ones we'll touch on today are if it's unreasonable for the young person to live at home or if they're supporting themselves through employment. There's some specific criteria that go into Centrelink assessing whether they should be independent based on both of those. Some of the other ways a young person can be considered independent include, for example, if they are a refugee, in their in-state care, so if they're in the care of a minister, or if they're an orphan. But we'll go on to the unreasonable to live at home requirements. So Centrelink can consider you to be independent if it's unreasonable to live at home. When they assess whether it's unreasonable to live at home, Centrelink look at a number of things, mainly whether there's been what they call an extreme family breakdown. They use the word extreme quite deliberately here as well. It's not enough for there to just be, I guess, a breakdown in the relationship at home. It needs to be quite, for lack of a better word, extreme. It's quite a high bar for it to be considered unreasonable for someone to live at home with their parents. Some of the things that could be taken into account with that can include, if the young person's perhaps been subject to family and domestic violence at home. It also ties into one of the other criteria around whether it's unreasonable is whether there's a serious risk to the safety and well-being of the young person. So, for example, if they're at risk of family and domestic violence, if they stay in the home perpetrated by a family member, possibly a parent, or they could be at risk of psychological, physical, sexual abuse. Really, it's a number of things that can be considered here. One of the other ways that it can be considered unreasonable to live at home is if the parents are unable, to provide a home. So that could take into account circumstances, for example, where a young person's parents might be homeless. They're not able to provide the young person with a home to be able to maintain their studies as a result. Generally, if you're younger than 18, it can be assessed by a Centrelink social worker, so they can, I guess, look at this and try and make a determination around whether it is unreasonable for the young person to live at home. One of the caveats here, though, is that you can't be considered independent. So under this criteria, if they're getting continuous support from a parent or someone acting as a long-term guardian. So a young person might have been subject to all of these sort of horrible events and have left the family home. But if they're living with another person that's acting as a parent or acting as a long-term guardian and providing that support to them, Centrelink might reject them for being considered independent. So again, it's tricky and quite a high bar to get over. Generally as well, the events that are considered extreme, there should be some sort of, ideally, documentation around them. So I guess, for example, that could be things like if there's social work reports, AVOs, things like that. We'll get into that a little bit later in a slide or two as well. All right, so next we've got a case study on an unreasonable to live at home situation. So Maria and her cousin Rosa, they were living out of their family home. They'd both moved out of their individual homes after Rosa had been assaulted by her own father and then admitted to a mental health unit. Maria had moved out of her parents' place to live with Rosa to help support her cousin. They were quite close friends. As Rosa had left the family home due to family violence and an extreme breakdown, Rosa was granted youth allowance as an independent, but Maria, who'd actually chosen to leave the home to help support Rosa, Centrelink was still considering her dependent on her parents. She hadn't had that same extreme family breakdown and had instead chosen to move out of home. But let's sort of take a step back here. So for example, in Rosa's situation where there's been, family and domestic violence in the family home, what sort of evidence do people think might be helpful, I guess, to provide to Centrelink to try and establish that it is unreasonable for Rosa to live at home? Feel free to put your ideas in the chat. All right, so Alison said police event number. Yeah, that could be good, particularly if there's a police report or something along with it. AVOs, doctor's reports, support letter from a caseworker, absolutely. Counsellors' reports as well, definitely. Social work reports, AVO, support letter from a DV service. Yeah, I think that could be helpful, as well. Mental health reports, support letter, stat deck. Yeah, I think stat deck in the absence of all that other stuff. Though, I imagine a young person that's left with this situation, hopefully there'd be bits and pieces of evidence around there, particularly like the discharge summaries for AVOs, things like that. So we've got an example here. Some of the other things, you've pretty much all covered off on them though. Social work reports, reports of supporting letters from the school, including the school counsellor, maybe a letter of support from the principal, medical reports, psychologist reports, AVOs, police reports, documents from fax perhaps, Yeah, there's quite a lot that could be helpful to provide to try and help show that someone's, I guess, been through these events and should be considered independent by Centrelink as a result. Now, I guess I had another question for you all. Let's say back in this scenario that Maria and her cousin Rosa, they both go to live with their auntie instead. They don't move out of home and are living by themselves. They're living with their auntie, and the auntie is acting as their guardian, providing food and support to them. You know, they're clothed, they're housed, they're fed, they're clothed. She looks after them as their own kids. Do you think they'd be eligible to be considered, particularly Rosa, would she be able to be considered independent then? All right. Got a bit of a mix today. We've got yeses, nos. I think it's unlikely they'd be considered independent if they're receiving support from someone else. Particularly, it's because of this last requirement, right? But if you're getting continuous support from a parent or someone acting as a long-term guardian, that despite how horrible the events that a young person might have been through are, if they're getting that support, they might not be able to be considered independent. I recall there was a tribunal decision years and years ago on a scenario like this where a young person had been subject to family domestic violence in the home perpetrated by their father, but the father and family allowed the young person to move out and then live in an apartment that the family owned, and supported them, I guess, by allowing them to live there. And so there was this tribunal decision about whether, you know, this young person being allowed to live in this apartment owned by the family was considered to be receiving continuous support. So you know, there is some nuance to it, and it really does depend on the circumstances around this support that the young person's getting. It's not as black and white as, you know, living with the auntie and she, I guess, gives you a roof over your head and pays for your food. All right, but we might stop to see if there's any questions anyone has on that side of things for now.
Okay, so if someone has a gap year and they're earning a wage, how does that contribute to independence? Is that something
If
you
they
can
have
answer?
a gap year and they're working,
I'm assuming they mean between, you know, high school and
yeah, and I guess
university.
if they're on youth allowance or they're going to study and apply for youth allowance, that is something I will get onto in the next slide, is whether you can be considered independent through work. So the next 2 slides may answer that.
Fair enough. So this is with youth allowance. Could you please clarify what you mean by, you said you were talking about independent youth allowance, under 18 and have a work history but experience education/employment disadvantage. I'm assuming that Kathy would like to know clarification on what the education/employment disadvantage means, as far as getting independent youth allowance.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Sorry, Brie.
What would be an education/employment disadvantage? I think that's what Kathy was trying to get clarification on. I guess it was probably an extenuating circumstance situation, and that's how they phrased it.
No, sorry, this is one of the independent sort of factors we had listed. Look, I'll be honest, I'm not sure off the top of my head. Yeah, there's a number of, I guess, factors that can go into whether a person's considered independent. Unfortunately, that is not one that I've looked too closely at. Sorry, Kathy. If we can find the relevant link to that information, Bo, I'm sure we'll try and send it to you.
Okay. Here's a member of a couple question, I'm guessing. If a young person's living with one parent and their partner, is the parent's partner included in is their income included in the parental income test? Yeah, so I'm assuming that's a member of a couple.
Yeah. So if the parent, I guess, is repartnered, does this parent's partner's income contribute to the income test? I would say yes. I imagine it would. Where parents are separated, though, there are some rules that can apply to how Centrelink assess the parental income and which parent's income to go off as well. They'll look at which parent the young person typically lives with, as well as factors like, which parent's income is more beneficial, things like that. Yeah, there is more information that you can find on that, though, in Centrelink's website, I believe.
Okay. It's an interesting question. What if a parent doesn't want to disclose their income? Are there ways around this? I guess I'm reading that as a situation where one of the parents perhaps is refusing to.
Yeah, and it could be through a number of reasons, right? Whether it's the parents mistrusting, I guess, of the social security system, or if there's, other factors at play. It could be anything from financial abuse to, I guess, any sort of reason behind it.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not actually too sure off the top of my head. Sorry, Emma. Again, it's a problem, but it's an issue that we don't come across too often.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's all the questions at the moment. There are a couple of others, but I just have to make it clear that, again, if they're very specific questions that could be considered legal advice, we can't actually answer them. So if I have skipped a question, that may be why. Sorry. Okay, Julius, back to you.
All right. So now, you can also be considered independent through work. So to be considered independent, for a young person to be considered independent, I guess through the work they've done, they need to have worked an average of 30 hours a week for at least 18 months within a 2-year period before they're studying. So it doesn't need to be 18 months in a row. It needs to be, I guess, for a total sort of 18 months, and they average the hours out over a 13-week period. So I guess if a young person has done 30 hours a week of work for 18 months within the 2 years, let's say it's that scenario with the person doing a gap year. If they've done 30 hours a week for 18 months during their gap year, then they might be able to be treated as independent through the work that they've done. What's considered work here includes things like paid work, whether they're taking annual leave, working overseas, things like that. Apprenticeships and traineeships, they can be taken into account too. There is another way as well, but you can be considered independent through work. So this is typically being considered independent through, I guess, full-time work or 30 hours a week, just shy of full-time work. You can be considered independent as well if you're an inner regional, outer regional, remote and very remote student required to live away from home for study, and you've completed part-time work of at least 15 hours a week over a 2-year period since leaving school. Or you've worked during a 14-month period since leaving school with earnings at least 75% of wage level A national training wage schedule of $30,000. At least that's what the figure was from 1st of July 2023. So quite a mouthful there. But I guess what the key there is that if you're a regional, remote or very remote student and you're working part-time, 15 hours a week over a 2-year period since you've left school, and a continuous 2-year period, so 2 years in a row, then you might be able to be considered independent as well. However, although I guess it's a variation of being considered independent, there is still a parental income threshold that applies for being considered independent through work. So at the moment, it's $160,000 plus $10,000 for each additional child. And it goes off the current or the previous year's parental taxable income, whichever is the most beneficial. Now, for whether you're considered inner regional, outer regional, remote, or very remote, you can actually check which category you fall under through this link here on Centrelink's website. They have a student regional area search where you can search your address to find out which category you fit under. You can also check whether you might be eligible to be considered independent through work, going from this website here as well. Now, with regional students in mind as well, there is another payment that they can access called the tertiary access payment. This is something that not many people know about, and from experiences I've heard, sometimes even Centrelink staff at the front counter haven't known that this is a thing that exists. So the tertiary access payment, what this is it's a one-off payment of either $3,000 or $5,000 that can be paid to someone who's starting tertiary study after year 12, and they're starting straight away, haven't taken a gap year. There are special reasons that can apply there. And they're moving from regional or remote area for tertiary study. And similar to that living away from home requirement as well, they need to be moving to study that's at an institution that's more than 90 minutes from where their parents live by public transport. There are some additional requirements as well. So for example, needs to be a Cert 4 or above, so Cert 4 diploma, advanced diploma, bachelor's, etc. Younger than 22 on the day they're starting the course, and you don't need to be receiving a Centrelink payment to apply for it. There is a parental income test though, needs to be under $250,000 a year. And you can find more information at the link at the bottom of the page there.
Okay, there's a couple more questions here. With youth allowance, independent rural through work for 2 years continuously. Does this include having a couple of weeks leave if it is unpaid?
That's another really good question. Look, I don't know off the top of my head. It sounds like the problem though there is that it's unpaid leave. I imagine if it was paid leave, it may be counted, but the fact that it's unpaid leave, that's, I guess, where the sticking point comes in there and whether that counts. No, I don't know off the top of my head, sorry.
Okay. Does a student need to be accessing youth allowance to receive the tertiary access payment?
No, you don't need to be getting a Centrelink payment to be able to apply for the tertiary access payment or to receive it.
Yeah.
As long as you meet all those other requirements.
Do scholarships count as income?
I think it depends on a number of factors, like what the scholarship's for, how much it is, things like that. Unfortunately, I feel like the answer is probably very specific depending on the scholarship itself, right?
Yeah, I will attempt to see if I can find some information on that in a minute. And that is all the questions for now. I am pretty sure I'm just checking.
All right,
Yep,
there
that's
is,
it.
I think, another opportunity a bit later on as well before we wrap up. So,
Yep, so if anybody has any more questions, please put them in the chat.
all right, now we'll move on to approved courses. So generally, to be eligible for youth allowance or study, you need to be studying an approved course. Not every course is going to be considered to be an approved course. So for example, some people might be eligible for youth allowance if they're studying at high school, a school-based apprenticeship, a traineeship, vocational education courses, a bridging course preparing them for tertiary study, TAFE courses, so that's your Cert 1, 2, 3, 4, diploma, etc. University courses, so for example, bachelor's degrees. Like I said earlier, though, there are additional requirements to apply for master's degrees, and it is limited, the master's degrees that you can receive a Centrelink payment for while you're studying. So there is this determination. It has a list of approved education providers and approved courses that you can find. I believe there's a hyperlink there as well that should be in the slides. Now, with vocational education and training courses, so VET courses, typically to be an approved course, it needs to be at a diploma level or higher and has to be approved for the VET student loan and done with an approved provider. You don't need to take out that student loan either. Now, we do have an example as well here with whether a course has been recognised for youth allowance or study purposes. So we can see here, Waleed was working in 2019 and early 2020. He was laid off when COVID hit and wasn't eligible for JobKeeper payment. So he ended up applying for job seeker payment. That was granted. He received that for some time and then decided that he wanted to actually return to uni and do his master's. He applied for Oz study. His job seeker payment was cancelled because he'd begun full-time study by that point. And then eventually he got a letter from Centrelink saying that he was rejected for Oz study because he wasn't studying an approved course. It turns out that in that determination, I linked to in one of his previous slides, that Waleed's course, his master's degree, wasn't considered to be an approved course from Centrelink. So no matter what Waleed's circumstances are, because it wasn't an approved course, he wouldn't have been able to get Oz study while he was studying that course. His only other option was that it was possible that if he dropped down to part-time study, that he might be able to reclaim job seeker. Unfortunately, because he wasn't eligible for any payment during payment one, he wasn't going to get any support there. But if he dropped down to part-time study, he might be able to get job seeker payment. He'd have to get it recognised, his study, with his job service provider, and would have to try and meet his mutual obligations. So there are pitfalls with studying, right? Not every course is going to be an approved course, and it's particularly tricky when it comes to master's level courses. But that link here is very helpful for trying to figure out whether a course is approved or not, particularly at that master's level. All right, now study loads. Typically, to be eligible for youth allowance or Oz study, you need to be studying a full-time study load. Centrelink assess a full-time study load as at least 75% of a normal full-time study load for the course you're doing. How the full-time study load for a course is assessed, really, it seems to be quite course specific. You know, some unis, they might assess whether you're full-time study or not based on the amount of credit points you're doing in a semester. Or something like, let's say, maybe some TAFEs, they might assess it based on the number of hours of study you're doing every semester. You also need to be making satisfactory progress as well for the course. So you need to be, you know, enrolled, engaged in your study, and I guess making good progress to try and meet those allowable time limits that we talked about briefly at the beginning. There are different ways it can be assessed as well, though, depending on things like if you're in distance education, you know, they use this different weighting measurement based on the total hours. In some situations, if you've reduced your study to less than a full-time study load, you may be eligible to keep receiving the payment. So for example, if you've reduced due to some sort of temporary incapacity, so medical conditions, or if there's special circumstances, or you've got a reasonable excuse. There are also additional rules that can apply for what are called concessional study loads, where some people can be eligible if they're studying 66% of a study load or 25% of a study load. They are, though, quite specific depending on whether you're on youth allowance or Oz study as well. Now, like I just touched on just then, there are some exemptions that can apply to these activity test requirements, so these study requirements, depending on, whether you've got a temporary incapacity, if you've claimed for disability support pension and you're on youth allowance job seeker, you might be placed on provisional youth allowance. And so what that is you don't have your mutual obligation requirements while they're assessing your disability support pension claim. There's also other exemptions, like if there's special circumstances, pre and postnatal exemptions. And we'll touch on a couple of those. So first of all is the temporary incapacity. So for an exemption to be granted due to a temporary incapacity, you need to first of all have some sort of temporary incapacity. So you need to be incapacitated, have some sort of medical condition, and be unable to continue studying full time. You need to be unable to undertake any other, what they call suitable activity as well. So for example, unable to work during that period as well. And your incapacity needs to be temporary. And so what that means is that you don't have a permanent condition. You also need to remain enrolled in your study while you're dealing with this temporary incapacity. Typically, there are some situations as well where permanent condition could be considered. Normally, it's not granted if you've got some sort of permanent condition that prevents you from being able to maintain your studies. Sometimes it can be granted if your permanent condition is flared up or exacerbated, if it's temporarily worsened. This is also one of the exemptions that can apply, for example, if you're on job seeker and you can't maintain your mutual obligation requirements. You can sometimes be exempt from meeting those requirements if you've got a temporary incapacity and a medical certificate from your doctor. You can also reduce or sometimes be exempt from these requirements for study if there's special circumstances. Centrelink, in their guide to social security law, they have a number of factors that they can take into account in special circumstances. So this can include things like if there's been a major disruptive event to the home, for example, if there's a fire, flood, break-ins, burglary, things like that. If there's been some sort of major personal crisis that the young person has gone through, so it could be something like the death of a family member, if they've been subject to family and domestic violence, if the young person's become homeless, if they've had to take on caring responsibilities for a family member. Normally, though, this special circumstances exemption is limited for the amount of time Centrelink can apply it for. Normally, it's only granted for a period of around 2 to 4 weeks. It depends on what your circumstances are. You do also need to remain enrolled and intend to continue with your study once whatever your circumstances are have subsided. If you've got a reasonable excuse, you can also reduce your study load. Typically, though, you do need to advise Centrelink of whatever the reasonable excuse is before you drop down or reduce your study. If you drop your study without advising Centrelink of what your circumstances are and you don't go back to full-time study within that semester, it could emerge later down the line that you've been overpaid youth allowance, for example. So some of the things that could be considered a reasonable excuse can include things like, if there's a lack of safe housing, if a young person has drug or alcohol dependence issues, if there's been relationship breakdowns, if they've been the victim of criminal violence. Again, though, the key is that they've remained enrolled in their course and that they intend to go back to full-time study. Now, as well, there's requirements around, like we touched on earlier, allowable time, so how much time you're allowed to study a course. For example, here we've got for year 12, you can have 2 attempts and still receive youth allowance as long as you meet all the other eligibility criteria. For most other courses, it really does depend on the length of course. If a course is a year or less, then it's up to double the course length. So for example, the allowable time for, let's say it's a 6-month course, you could have up to a year's allowable time to complete the course. Like I said earlier as well, if the course goes for more than 1 year and it doesn't have any year-long subjects, so let's say a Bachelor of Arts 3-year degree, The minimum time is 3 years plus an additional semester, so 3.5. Any time you've spent studying the course though before you claim your youth allowance is actually counted towards your allowable time. So it doesn't actually matter whether you've received a Centrelink payment while you've been studying the course as well. So for example, if you're, I guess, working and don't get youth allowance for all of your first semester of study, and then finally claim youth allowance when you're in your second semester, that first semester of study is still going to count towards your allowable time for youth allowance over the length of this course as well. With youth allowance, though, there is no limit on the number of courses you can do at the same level. That limit is specifically to AusStudy, and I believe, Valentia, it's to AbStudy as well, that there's the limits of assistance for number of courses you can do at a particular level. With youth allowance, you can study more than one course at the same level, but of course there's allowable time rules are still going to apply, so you need to finish the course within that allowable time period, or the payment could be cancelled. Now, something that we'll also touch on is mutual obligation requirements. So typically, if you're on a payment that has job search requirements, you'll be subject to mutual obligations. This includes things like youth allowance other, so that's youth allowance with job search requirements. If you're on job seeker payment, parenting payment, some parents are subject to mutual obligation requirements as well. If you're on a special benefit payment, you may have to meet these requirements. And as well for people on the disability support pension that are under 35, they have some limited mutual obligation requirements as well. In my experiences, though, for people on the DSP under 35, a lot of those requirements have included things like, engaging with their disability employment service, and doing things like continuing to engage in their medical treatments, having appointments with their psychologist, things like that. So what do mutual obligations include? Typically, they are managed by Workforce Australia now. You'll be referred to either Workforce Australia online or their in-person, services through a provider. Really, it depends on the individual needs. I think typically most people are put through to Workforce Australia online if it's the first time they're engaging with it. Your requirements can include things like, engaging with a job provider, signing up for a job plan, meeting your points requirements. For most people, it's 100 points of activities a month. So that's, looking for jobs, attending interviews, could be doing things like training, attending appointments with a provider, etc. You do also have requirements to find and accept suitable offers of paid work. So for example, if a job you've been offered is suitable and you turn it down, you can be penalised for that. Sometimes full or part-time study can be included in a job plan. So with that example we gave earlier about Waleed, where his master's degree wasn't counted as an allowable course for AusStudy, it's possible Waleed may be able to get job seeker payment while he's still studying part-time. He will need to get it recognised though in his job plan with his job provider. Unfortunately, with the way the system works, it sometimes feels like you're at the whims of the provider. It depends on them whether they approve it or not. Depends on a number of factors as well, like the length of the course as well, and whether the course is going to improve the person's employability. Excuse me. If it is accepted though, it can reduce your other mutual obligation requirements. So for example, those 100 points might be reduced if the study has been accepted for someone's job plan. If someone doesn't meet their requirements, then there can be, penalties that flow from there. So for example, if they don't attend appointments with their job provider, the Centrelink payments can actually be suspended. And I believe you've got, at the moment, 2 days to re-engage with your job provider before your payment's suspended if you miss an appointment. Some of the other issues that can happen is you can be demerited if you don't fulfill your job search requirements. If you don't accept suitable work, your Centrelink payment, so your job seeker payment or youth allowance as a job seeker, could actually be suspended for 4 weeks. Centrelink do define, though, what is suitable work, so they do look at a number of factors in whether the work's suitable, including things like, the amount of time it takes to travel there. There are some exemptions that can also apply again like we touched on earlier, for example, if you have a reasonable excuse. If a person's payment is suspended or cancelled, they do also have a right to appeal Centrelink decisions. We'll touch on that a bit later. So some of the other, similar to the activity test sort of exemptions we touched on earlier for youth allowance, so these are ways you can reduce your study load and still possibly be able to receive youth allowance. There are similar for job search payments where you can be exempt from meeting your mutual obligation requirements. So first and probably the most common we see is if you've got a temporary medical incapacity. So if you're unable to meet your job search requirements because of a medical condition. Like I said, though, it does need to be temporary. Typically, it's not granted if you do have a permanent condition. Often Centrelink will say if you've got a permanent condition, you may be eligible for the disability support pension instead. Other things that can contribute to whether you should be exempt from your job search requirements can include things like if there's a family crisis, family and domestic violence, homelessness, disasters, including fire and floods, some circumstances involving care of kids as well. So for example, I think there's a large parent exemption that can apply if you have 4 or 5 children in your care. All right. Any further questions from there?
Yes, there are. Okay, so is there a time limit on having an application submitted for the tertiary access payment? For example, if somebody started studying in February, what's the time limit for when they can apply?
Just checking to see if I've got any information on that. Look, I don't know off the top of my head. The thing with tertiary access payment is that I've only come across it once before. It's incredibly rare that we actually come across this.
Okay. It appears to say online applications open 1st of January and close 31st of December each calendar year for students who meet eligibility criteria.
Is this for the tertiary access payment, Bray?
Yeah.
Okay.
In your first year of study, it makes that really clear as well. Okay.
Yeah, it's a very, very niche and specific payment.
So with youth allowance affecting parents' family tax benefit, if kids are getting youth allowance and they're living with their parents at home, and it's affecting the parents' family tax benefit,
yeah,
is there anything that can be done about that?
With family tax benefit, the way that works is you've got to have what's called a family tax benefit child. That's how it's defined under the Family Assistance Act in your care. And a child ceases to be considered what they call a family tax benefit child if they receive an income support payment in their own right. So if, a kid is getting a youth allowance payment, it means the parent isn't eligible to receive family tax benefit for that kid. Similarly, for example, it could be if a kid is getting maybe a special benefit, they might be at risk of homelessness, their parent wouldn't be able to receive family tax benefit for them at the same time the child gets their own payment. I don't believe there's any way around that as well.
Yeah. If a student becomes homeless, can they receive Centrelink allowances?
Yeah, and it really depends on their circumstances, right? There's a number of things that can contribute to that, like their age. So, for example, if a child's homeless, they may be eligible for a payment called special benefit. Really, I guess there's a number of things that can go into and contribute to that, right? Like whether they're studying or not as well. There's all sorts of factors that contribute to it, but generally, I'd say if a kid's homeless, they may be eligible for a Centrelink payment, as long as they meet the requirements for it.
What are the mutual obligation requirements for special benefit, and who determines that?
And it's hard to give a straight answer, and the reason is because a person's mutual obligation requirements, they're so specific to or supposed to be quite specific to the person and their circumstances. So I guess it'd be, the person and the job provider that determine what their requirements are.
Okay. Lindy would like you to clarify, did you say earlier that you could be eligible for a dependent away from home rate if you need to travel at least 90 minutes by public transport to access study? Was that correct?
Yeah, I think so. If you need to travel 90 minutes or more from the parent's home by public transport to access study.
And that would be each way, correct? Yeah.
I think so. I don't know if that's specific, but it's each way, but I would imagine it is each way.
If you discontinue study, do you have to pay back any Centrelink benefits you've received during the period of time you were receiving, like Oz study, for example?
Not unless you didn't tell Centrelink that you dropped out
Yeah.
of study. So if you do reduce your study load or drop out of study, then you do have an obligation to tell Centrelink within 14 days of, I guess, deciding to do that or doing that. If you don't tell Centrelink and may become aware of it in the future, this is actually something I come across quite often, is Centrelink may become aware of it in the future, often they data match with education providers like unis, and may raise a debt against the person in the future and ask them to repay the money.
Mm. Okay. So I'm so sorry. Just trying to, a lot of these are very specific. What level of evidence is required to prove full-time employment and earnings?
I'd imagine payslips would probably be the key there, particularly if the payslips specify, the amount of hours per week that the person is working. Sorry.
No, I was agreeing with you.
Yeah, I don't think something like tax returns would be enough because they wouldn't specify the hours of a person studying. And I think that's really key to being considered independent through work is the hours. Sorry, hours you're working, not studying.
Here's one that might be a little easier. What's the process of switching from student to job seeker when you finish your course? How would you go about that?
You'd notify Centrelink, and I think there might actually be an expedited claim process if you're transferring from a student payment to job seeker payment. It's a very long time since I did that though, so I can't remember off the top of my head. But I think it is an easier process to transfer from youth allowance to job seeker payment. Really, I think it's a matter of notifying Centrelink that your course is coming up as well, and being in contact with them to try and go through and get that process done.
And here's a interesting one. If you're trying to prove income to Centrelink for independence, for example, is there a provision when the employer pays you cash in hand with no pay slips?
Yeah, that's really tricky because without any sort of pay slips, how do you prove the amount of hours you're working? And if you kept, for example, a diary of your work, I don't know if that would be sufficient. And I think it's likely a problem that a lot of young people are going to be facing, trying to be considered independent through work as well, if they have perhaps been meeting these requirements as that, a lot of people with their first job, it might be something like that where they're getting paid cash in hand. And they could be getting paid cash in hand for any reason, it could be something from a dodgy employer to maybe legitimately getting paid cash in hand. I don't know.
Yeah.
Though in the absence of payslips, how do you prove it? There's no sort of visions around that I know off the top of my head. It's not to say that they don't exist, just that I'm not sure.
I would guess that you'd probably have to ask the employer to give you pay slips.
Yeah.
So that appears to be all of the questions that are non-specific enough to be answered at the moment.
All right, and we're on the home stretch now. So the last main topic I'm going to go into today is newly arrived residents' waiting periods and a little bit on the special benefit payment. So for most newly arrived residents in Australia, they'll have to serve what's called a newly arrived residents waiting period. So this is typically a period of time before they're eligible to receive any Centrelink payments. So for an example of this, it could be, if a family member has recently arrived in Australia and they've been granted a permanent visa, they'll typically have to wait a number of years before they're eligible to receive the payment. So here we have the examples of the payments and how long the waiting periods are for newly arrived residents. So for example, there's a 4-year waiting period that applies for most payments. This applies for job seeker, youth allowance, Oz study, parenting payment, special benefit. It's quite a long period of time. It was increased to 4 years from 2, I believe, back in January of 2019. There are some shorter waiting periods as well, depending on the payment. So for example, for carer payment, it has a 2-year newly arrived residents waiting period. For carer allowance and family tax benefit A, it's a 1 year, and there's no waiting period for family tax benefit Part B and the childcare subsidy. There are some ways that a person can be exempt from having to serve the newly arrived residents waiting period to be eligible for a payment. So these can include things like if they are the holder of a temporary humanitarian visa, or if the young person or the person claiming is a refugee themselves or a former refugee. They might also be exempt if they're the family member of a refugee. How Centrelink determined family member of a refugee is quite complicated as well, but it can include things like their partner or dependent children. You also don't have to serve a newly arrived residents waiting period if you're an Australian citizen. So if you've been granted citizenship, you won't be subject to, for example, the 4-year waiting period for job seeker payment. You may also not have to serve the waiting period if you've applied for special benefit and you've experienced what Centrelink call a substantial change in circumstances that's outside of your control since you've come to Australia. Special benefit itself, though, it's quite a complicated payment. It's not something that I touched on earlier. It is a discretionary payment of last resort. So Centrelink won't grant someone special benefit if they're eligible for another payment. So for example, if you're eligible for job seeker payment, you typically wouldn't be granted special benefit. So first of all, you need to be unable to receive another payment, and you need to be in financial hardship and unable to obtain or earn a sufficient livelihood for yourself and for any dependents. So you need to have some sort of reason that you're not able to work and earn a livelihood. You also do need to be in Australia when you're applying and either a resident, so permanent resident, citizen, or hold a specified visa. So there's some subclasses of visa that can be eligible for special benefit. It does also have an income and assets test. The income test for special benefit is a dollar for dollar reduction. So for example, if you're working, every dollar of income you earn reduces your special benefit by $1. It also has additional tests called the short and long-term available funds tests. It has a liquid assets cutoff as well. If your liquid assets, your readily available funds exceed more than $5,000, the special benefit will be cancelled or you'll be rejected for it. So for example, if you've got $5,000 in savings, you won't be eligible for special benefit. It's particularly tricky as well with things like the Red Cross family and domestic violence payment, right? If that payment's $5,000 and you've just received it, your special benefit could be cancelled, which is terrible. And like I said earlier, you won't have to serve the 4-year waiting period for special benefit if you've had a substantial change in circumstances that's outside your control since you came to Australia. So this can take into account a number of things, right? Like, unfortunately, probably the most common one I've seen is if there is family and domestic violence that the applicant's been subject to. There are also additional rules that can apply depending on a person's age. So, for example, a child could be eligible for special benefit if their parent holds a visa that's not eligible to receive any payments and the child's at risk of homelessness. It's typically not intended to be paid to students. Sometimes it can, though, if they're doing full or part-time study and it's part of their job search requirements and included in the mutual obligation requirements. Generally, though, it's quite limited, the situations where someone will receive special benefit. It's really if they're not eligible for anything else at all. All right, one of the last things I wanted to touch on is appealing a Centrelink decision. So Centrelink decisions can be appealed. You do have a right to appeal Centrelink decisions. Not all decisions should be appealed, though. For example, Centrelink debts can increase on appeal. So that video case study we had much earlier on in the presentation where the young person was working and may have been inaccurately reporting their income to Centrelink, if they appealed, there could be a risk that their debt could increase if they were incorrectly reporting from a much earlier period as well. Sometimes as well, Centrelink can prosecute people or refer them to prosecution. Generally, though, it is quite rare, but it's not to say that it doesn't happen because it does. Now, with appeals as well, there are time limits that can apply. So, for example, with Centrelink debts, there's no time limit to appeal to a review officer within Centrelink to seek an internal appeal or to appeal to the first tier of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. But then there's 28 days to appeal to the second level of the tribunal in the federal court. With, for example, if you're rejected for youth allowance or your youth allowance cancelled, there's a time limit of 13 weeks to seek an internal appeal. Similarly, 13 weeks to apply to the first tier of tribunal, and then that 28 days is across the board, for the second level of tribunal in the federal court. With ab study, the appeals process and time limits, they're quite different. There's no time limit to appeal an internal appeal to an authorised review officer if you've been rejected for ab study or if you're appealing the rate of your ab study payment. But that can't be appealed to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. Instead, you need to apply for ministerial review if your ab study is rejected or you've got a problem with the rate. However, with ab study debts, there is a time limit of 13 weeks to appeal those. It can be extended if there are special circumstances that can apply, and that's 13 weeks to appeal to a review officer and the first tier of the tribunal, and then it's 28 days from there to the second tier of the federal court. All right, any questions before we wrap up?
Sorry, I think there was one. Oh, how many hours of TAFE study is considered full-time study? I'm not sure if that was for youth allowance or a study or if it makes a difference. I don't believe it does, but.
I want to throw a number out there, but I don't want to be wrong.
Okay, I did include a link to what I think is the relevant page, but if you don't know the answer.
I have a sneaking suspicion that it may be 20 hours, but I can't say for certain, unfortunately. Though I do know that there is information on the amount of hours TAFE considers full-time that you can find online, possibly on Centrelink's website.
Okay. No, that would be the end. Oh, sorry. Why is the well, I don't know if you can answer this, but why is the ab study debt appeal only 13 weeks?
I don't know, and it's really, really inconsistent, and to be honest, quite ridiculous. That there's no time limit to appeal other Centrelink debts. For example, if you have a depth of a disability support pension if you were overpaid that. But there's a 13-week appeal time limit for ab study. I don't know why there is, but it's frustrating and inconsistent.
Yeah. I mean, there's been a few questions like this, basically people pointing out essentially that how difficult it can be when Centrelink, when a course doesn't have the available, like in rural places, they might not have the courses available at that time, so it goes over the allowable period, or they only have a small amount of hours of their course. So yeah, not really a question, just acknowledging that people are really frustrated about that.
Absolutely. And it's such a complicated process to try and navigate, a complicated system to try and navigate with Centrelink as well. And it's full of, I guess, situations that can go wrong, unfortunately.
Okay, so we've got 4 minutes left if you want to move on to the last few slides.
All right, fantastic. And I'll hand back over to you from here then, Brie.
Okay. So if you have a problem with Centrelink in New South Wales and you wish to speak to someone at Welfare Rights Centre, our client intake line is open every Monday and Wednesday from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 a.m. p.m. Sorry. Or you can contact us online through our website or via email. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn for regular updates and educational information. Registrations are now open on our website for our upcoming Domestic and Family Violence and Centrelink webinar, which is running in September. So if you'd like to register for that, get onto our website. And we would really appreciate it if you could take 5 minutes to please complete our evaluation survey. Your feedback helps us to improve, and it also helps us secure funding so we can continue providing free webinars like the one you attended today. I will be emailing this out as well in about half an hour. So we hope you enjoyed the session today, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you to Julius and Alentia.
Thanks, Brie. Thanks, Alentia.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.